A courtroom. A judge. A defendant in chains. But behind the cold procedures lies a decades-old friendship and a secret that could change everything. When duty clashes with loyalty. How far will one judge go to seek the truth? Drop a comment and share where you're joining us from. If stories like this resonate with you, hit subscribe so you don't miss our next inspiring journey. Judge Eleanor Thompson entered courtroom 3B of the Hammond Parish Courthouse, her black robe flowing behind her like a shadow. The polished mahogany bench gleamed under the soft, filtered light streaming through tall arched windows. Her gavel rested to her right, a symbol of authority she had wielded with precision and fairness for over a decade. To the attorneys, clerks, and bailiffs, she was a figure of unwavering resolve. But today, an unfamiliar tightness clenched her chest. The courtroom buzzed with muted whispers as the bailiff, Officer Gerald Tate, stepped forward, his voice steady and commanding. The state of Louisiana versus Benjamin Carter. Eleanor's breath hitched. The name reverberated in her mind, each syllable striking with the weight of memory. Two uniformed deputies escorted Benjamin into the courtroom. His wrists cuffed, his shoulders squared despite the heaviness in his steps. He lifted his head, and their eyes met. Benjamin Carter, her childhood friend. Eleanor gripped the bench edge, her knuckles white as fleeting images flooded her mind. Two kids racing bikes down dusty country roads, climbing magnolia trees with scraped knees, and watching the sunset over Hammond's sprawling fields. Their laughter had been a rebellion against the unspoken barriers of their segregated town. Their friendship had been an unyielding bond in a world that tried to keep them apart. But now Benjamin stood before her, shackled and accused. She cleared her throat, her voice firm but softer than usual. Mr. Carter, you are here today to answer charges brought against you by the state of Louisiana. I expect full decorum in this courtroom. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Benjamin said, his voice steady but carrying a raw edge. Eleanor forced herself to look away, shifting her gaze to the stack of case files in front of her. The prosecutor, Edward Hale, adjusted his tie and rose from his seat. With slick back hair and a sharp, predatory air, Edward was known for his cutthroat courtroom demeanor. Your Honor, the prosecution is prepared to present its case against Mr. Carter. Edward began. We aim to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the defendant committed armed robbery and aggravated assault at a convenience store in Baton Rouge on the night of September 14th. The words hung heavy in the air. Eleanor stole another glance at Benjamin, who remained motionless, his expression calm but his eyes swimming with a storm of emotions. From the defense table, a younger woman in a charcoal suit shuffled her papers and stood. Amanda Price, Benjamin's defense attorney, was sharp, driven, and carried an air of defiance that came with youth and unyielding belief in her client's innocence. Your Honor, the defense is ready, Amanda said, her voice crisp and confident. Eleanor nodded, gesturing for both sides to sit. She shifted her attention to the jury box, where 12 ordinary citizens sat, their faces blank slates ready to absorb evidence and testimony. The weight of their responsibility mirrored her own. As the opening arguments began, Eleanor's focus wavered. She listened as Edward detailed Benjamin's past arrests, small, petty crimes, nothing close to the gravity of the current charges. Amanda countered with measured words, emphasizing that assumptions and biases had no place in a courtroom. But Eleanor's mind kept slipping back to her childhood. She remembered the promise they had made under the branches of that towering magnolia tree. No matter where life takes us, we'll always have each other. Her chest tightened as reality collided with memory. Benjamin Carter wasn't just another defendant in her courtroom. He was a reminder of a shared past, of innocence lost and promises broken. The weight of the gavel had never felt so heavy in her hand. The air in the courtroom felt dense, heavy with unspoken truths and buried memories. Judge Eleanor Thompson sat tall on the bench, her face composed, though her mind remained a storm of conflict. Across the courtroom, Benjamin Carter sat at the defendant's table, his shoulders squared but his gaze distant, as though he were somewhere far away, perhaps back in the days when life was simpler, when trust and friendship weren't overshadowed by shackles and accusations. Prosecutor Edward Hale adjusted his glasses as he stepped toward the jury box, his voice sharp and confident. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, the evidence will show that the defendant, Benjamin Carter, entered McKinney's Corner store on the night of September 14th with malicious intent. Armed and dangerous, he terrorized an innocent store clerk, leaving both physical and emotional scars. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a crime, and justice must prevail." Eleanor listened, her face an impassive mask. Edward's words were rehearsed, calculated, a performance aimed at locking Benjamin away forever. The jury sat still, their eyes trained on the prosecutor, absorbing every word. On the other side, defense attorney Amanda Price scribbled a note on her yellow legal pad before standing. Her voice, though softer than Edward's, carried a sharp edge. "Your Honor, members of the jury, the prosecution's narrative relies heavily on assumptions, weak evidence, and the exploitation of a man's past mistakes. Benjamin Carter has a history, that much is true, but history doesn't define guilt. The evidence will show there's more to this story than what the state wants you to believe." Amanda's eyes lingered briefly on Benjamin before she sat down, her pen tapping softly against her notepad. The first witness was called, Michael Wheeler, the convenience store clerk, a wiry man with tired eyes and trembling hands. Michael took the stand. Edward led the questioning. "Mr. Wheeler, can you confirm that Benjamin Carter was the man who assaulted you that night?" Edward asked. Michael hesitated, his eyes darting toward Benjamin before locking onto his own hands. I think so. I mean, it was dark, and it all happened so fast. But, yes, I think it was him." Edward pressed on, painting a picture of chaos and fear, each question tightening the noose around Benjamin. But Amanda was ready. When it was her turn, she approached the witness stand with measured steps, her voice calm and steady. "Mr. Wheeler, you said it was dark. The store's security footage was grainy, wasn't it?" Michael nodded hesitantly. "And the assailant was wearing a hood, correct?" Amanda continued. "Why, yes." Amanda paused, letting silence hang in the air before speaking again. "So, Mr. Wheeler, you can't say with absolute certainty that the person who attacked you was Benjamin Carter, can you?" The clerk squirmed under her gaze. I guess not with absolute certainty. No." A ripple of unease passed through the jury box. Eleanor shifted in her seat, her hands tightly clasped. She had presided over countless cases, heard countless testimonies, but this one gnawed at her. Each word, each detail, seemed to pull her further into a chasm of doubt. The next piece of evidence was the surveillance footage. The screen flickered to life, showing a grainy chap and white recording of a hooded figure moving through narrow aisles. The figure's movements were hurried but not entirely clear. Edward argued that the defendant's build and gait matched Benjamin's. Amanda countered that the footage was inconclusive, little more than shadows and blurry shapes. Benjamin sat silently as the footage played, his face expressionless. But Eleanor caught the faintest flicker in his eyes, a mixture of frustration and resignation. As the day wore on, witness testimonies and arguments painted two conflicting pictures, one of a dangerous man caught in the act, and another of a man caught in the system's machinery. When the court recessed for the day, Eleanor remained seated as the room emptied. The weight of her robe felt suffocating. Her gaze lingered on Benjamin as he was led away in handcuffs. She wanted to believe in the system. She wanted to believe that truth would reveal itself in the light of cross-examination and sworn testimony. But doubt clung to her, a shadow she couldn't shake. As the heavy doors of the courtroom closed, Eleanor exhaled slowly, her breath shaky. The lines between duty and humanity had begun to blur, and she knew that whatever path lay ahead, it would test the very core of who she was. The courtroom carried an air of restless tension as the trial resumed the next morning. Judge Eleanor Thompson adjusted her glasses and glanced briefly at Benjamin Carter, who sat at the defense table, his hands folded tightly together. His shoulders were squared, but the weight of his circumstances pressed visibly upon him. Amanda Price sat beside him, her expression sharp, her focus unwavering. Across the aisle, Edward Hale shuffled his notes with a theatrical confidence. Prosecution calls Officer Daniel Miles to the stand, Edward announced. A tall, broad-shouldered police officer took his seat at the witness stand, his uniform crisp, his badge gleaming under the fluorescent lights. His voice was firm as he described the night of Benjamin's arrest. We received a description of the suspect from the store clerk, a tall male. Dark hoodie, jeans, moving quickly on foot. We spotted Mr. Carter walking a few blocks away from the store shortly after the reported incident. Edward nodded, his voice deliberate. So, Officer Miles, based on the description and proximity, you apprehended Mr. Carter on the spot? Yes, sir. He matched the description, and he seemed nervous when we approached him. Amanda stood, her heels clicking against the polished floor as she approached the witness stand. Officer Miles, did you find any stolen goods or weapons on Mr. Carter when you arrested him? The officer hesitated. No, ma'am. And you mentioned he seemed nervous. Would you say that's an unusual reaction for someone approached by law enforcement late at night? Amanda pressed. Miles shifted slightly in his seat. Well, no. I suppose not. Amanda paused for effect, then asked, did anyone witness Mr. Carter fleeing the scene of the crime? No, ma'am. Only the clerk's description. Amanda nodded and returned to her seat. The cracks in the prosecution's narrative were subtle, but they were there, and the jury noticed. Next, the surveillance footage played again on the screen at the front of the courtroom. The grainy black and white video showed the hooded figure moving quickly through narrow aisles before rushing out the door. Edward emphasized the figure's build, pointing out similarities to Benjamin. But Amanda had her own questions. Officer Miles, was this footage timestamped accurately? The officer frowned. As far as I know. Yes. As far as you know. Amanda repeated, her voice sharp. But no forensic expert has confirmed the footage's accuracy. Have they? No, ma'am. A murmur rippled through the jury box. Eleanor noticed the subtle shift in their expressions. The first seeds of doubt had taken root. The prosecution then called another witness, a neighborhood resident who claimed to have seen someone like Benjamin walking near the store. But under Amanda's cross-examination, the witness admitted the street had been dimly lit, and the figure was wearing a hood. By midday, the prosecution's case began to wobble. Though Edward Hale worked tirelessly to patch the cracks with sharp words and carefully framed questions, still, Eleanor could feel the weight of doubt settling into the room. During a recess, Eleanor remained on the bench, staring down at her gavel. Memories of her childhood friendship with Benjamin resurfaced, moments of laughter, moments of trust. The young boy she'd once known wasn't the man painted by the prosecution. But the law didn't deal in memories, it dealt in facts. And the facts remained frustratingly incomplete. When the trial resumed, Amanda called Benjamin to the stand. The room fell silent as he walked forward, the chains at his ankles faintly clinking with each step. He raised his hand, swore his oath, and sat. Eleanor's heart clenched as she prepared to hear Benjamin Carter speak, not just as a defendant, but as the boy she once knew. The truth, fractured and elusive, was waiting just beyond the next question. The soft hum of the courthouse air conditioning did little to ease the tension in courtroom 3B. Judge Eleanor Thompson sat behind the bench, her hands resting on the polished wood surface as Benjamin Carter settled into the witness chair. His orange jumpsuit contrasted sharply with the pristine white of his oath-bound hand. The chains at his ankles rattled faintly as he adjusted his posture. The weight of every eye in the room pressed down on him. "Mr. Carter," Amanda Price began, her voice steady but gentle. "Can you tell the court where you were on the night of September 14th? Benjamin cleared his throat. "I was walking home from my cousin's house. I cut through the back streets to save time. That's when the police stopped me." Amanda nodded. "And did you have any stolen goods or weapons on you when they searched you?" "No, ma'am. I didn't have anything but my phone and a few dollars." The jury watched Benjamin closely, their faces a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Amanda pressed on. "Why do you think they stopped you?" Benjamin hesitated, his voice lowering. "Because I fit the description. A tall black man in a hoodie, walking at night." The silence that followed was suffocating. Prosecutor Edward Hale rose from his seat with a smirk that barely hid his condescension. "Mr. Carter, isn't it true that you have a criminal record? Isn't it true that you've been arrested before for petty theft and trespassing?" Amanda objected, but Eleanor overruled, her voice tight. "I'll allow it. Proceed carefully." "Mr. Hale." "Yes. I've been arrested before," Benjamin admitted. "But I've served my time. I've been trying to keep my head down, trying to do right." Edward's smile faded. He returned to his seat, seemingly satisfied with the seeds of doubt he had planted. Eleanor's gaze lingered on Benjamin as he stepped down from the witness stand. There was something in his voice, something raw and familiar, that clawed at the edges of her carefully composed exterior. She could almost hear the echoes of his younger self, the boy she had once spent hours talking to under the old magnolia tree. The courtroom recessed for lunch, but Eleanor remained at her bench, staring at the empty witness chair. Her mind spiraled back to a summer afternoon decades ago. The weight of the gavel felt heavier in Judge Eleanor Thompson's hand as the courtroom reconvened the next morning. The polished mahogany bench, which had always been a symbol of clarity and authority, now felt like a barrier, a wall between her duty to the law and her duty to the truth. Eleanor's eyes swept across the room, landing briefly on Benjamin Carter. He sat still at the defense table, his hands folded, his eyes downcast but resolute. Amanda Price stood with measured confidence as she called her next witness, Officer Daniel Miles, the arresting officer. Once again, "Officer Miles," Amanda began, her voice sharp but steady. "You testified yesterday that Benjamin Carter was arrested based on a description provided by the store clerk. But let's clarify something. Was Mr. Carter carrying any stolen goods or weapons when you stopped him?" "No, ma'am," Officer Miles replied. "And you said the footage from the convenience store showed a figure wearing a hoodie and jeans, correct?" "Yes." Amanda approached the evidence table and picked up a printed still image from the surveillance footage. She held it up for the jury to see. Officer Miles, would you agree that this image is grainy and that the suspect's face is not clearly visible? Miles hesitated before answering. Yes. It's not clear. Amanda placed the image back on the table. So, Officer Miles, what we have is a vague description, grainy footage, and no physical evidence linking Mr. Carter directly to this crime. Isn't that correct? Miles shifted uncomfortably. That's correct. Edward Hale objected, claiming Amanda was leading the witness. But Eleanor overruled him. Her voice was calm, but there was a tremor of unease beneath the surface. The forensic analyst was next on the stand. Amanda led them through a painstaking explanation of inconsistencies in the surveillance footage timestamp. Based on your analysis, Amanda pressed, is it possible that the timestamp on this footage could have been altered? Yes, the analyst confirmed. There are irregularities consistent with tampering. The jury stirred. Whispers rippling across the box. Edward Hale leaned back in his chair, his jaw tight, his once confident demeanor now visibly strained. Eleanor could feel the case unraveling, thread by thread. The evidence was weak, the testimonies inconsistent, and doubt hung thick in the air. But it was the memory, the phrase from Benjamin's childhood, that kept gnawing at Eleanor's mind. It was too unique, too specific, to be ignored. It was as if the truth was crouched in the corner of the courtroom, waiting for her to acknowledge it. She called for a recess. In the quiet of her chambers, Eleanor leaned against her desk, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The weight of her robe felt suffocating. She knew the law. She knew her role. But she also knew Benjamin Carter, the boy who had been her friend, her confidant, and, for a brief, golden time, her family. Moments later, Amanda and Edward stood in her chambers, tension crackling between them. Eleanor spoke carefully, deliberately. I need to disclose something, she began. I knew Benjamin Carter when we were children. We grew up together. Edward's face hardened. Your Honor. This... Eleanor raised a hand. I have remained impartial throughout these proceedings. But there is a detail that came up yesterday, a phrase used during the cross-examination. A phrase Benjamin said to me once as a child. It's not something you'd forget. And I need to know if it came from him directly or if it was assumed. Amanda looked at her intently. What phrase? Your Honor. Eleanor's voice was barely above a whisper. Sometimes the world's got its foot on your neck, and you're just trying to breathe. Amanda's brow furrowed, while Edward's lips pressed into a thin line. If Benjamin said those words at the time of his arrest, Eleanor continued, it would mean something significant. It could indicate his state of mind, or even where he was when this happened. Edward sighed, rubbing his temples. What are you suggesting? Judge Ellison? I'm suggesting that you ask the right questions before this case moves forward, Eleanor said firmly. When the trial resumed, Edward Hale approached Amanda at the prosecution table. After a hushed exchange, Amanda turned and whispered something to Benjamin. Moments later, Edward addressed the court. The state would like to propose a resolution to this case. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Eleanor's pulse quickened as Edward continued. The state is prepared to offer a reduced charge with time served. Mr. Carter would be released immediately. Amanda turned to Benjamin, her eyes wide with cautious hope. Benjamin gave a small nod. Eleanor's gavel came down with a sharp crack. The court accepts the resolution. Mr. Carter is free to go. The courtroom erupted into murmurs. But Eleanor's focus remained on Benjamin as the cuffs were removed from his wrists. As he turned to leave, he glanced up at her, just briefly, and in that look, Eleanor saw gratitude, confusion, and something else, the faint flicker of hope. The turning point had come. But Eleanor knew this story wasn't over, not for her, and certainly not for Benjamin Carter. The courtroom had emptied, leaving behind an eerie stillness. Judge Eleanor Thompson remained seated on the bench, staring at the space where Benjamin Carter had stood moments before. The sound of the gavel still echoed faintly in her mind. A final punctuation mark on a trial that had left her spirit heavy. Benjamin was free. The deal struck between Amanda Price and Edward Hale had secured his immediate release. But it wasn't a victory, not a clean one. At least, Eleanor could still feel the tension hanging in the air. The weight of the doubts left unanswered. She stepped down from the bench, her black robe sweeping the polished floor as she made her way to her chambers. But just as she reached the door, she heard a voice behind her. "Judge Ellison." She turned to see Benjamin standing there, free of handcuffs but carrying the same weariness in his eyes. Amanda stood a few steps behind him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, giving them space. For a long moment, neither Eleanor nor Benjamin spoke. The silence was heavy, laden with decades of unspoken words. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" Benjamin's voice was low, but steady. Eleanor's chest tightened. Because I was afraid. Afraid of compromising the case. Afraid of overstepping." Benjamin nodded slowly, disappointment flickering in his eyes. "You were afraid. But I was in chains." Maggie. The childhood name, Maggie, cut through her like glass. Eleanor felt her throat tighten as regret rose like a wave within her. "I failed you, Benjamin," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I should have done more. I should have spoken sooner. But I promise you, I'll carry this with me. And I'll make it count." Benjamin studied her for a long moment before giving a faint nod. "I hope you do." He turned and walked away, Amanda following close behind. Eleanor watched them go until they disappeared through the heavy wooden doors. Alone in the silence of the courthouse, Eleanor felt the weight of the system she served pressing down on her shoulders. Justice had been done, technically. But fairness? Fairness was something else entirely. She walked back to her chambers, her footsteps echoing in the hollow hallway. The echoes of the past still lingered. But Eleanor knew one thing for certain: silence would no longer be her refuge. The sun dipped low on the horizon, casting a warm amber glow through the tall windows of Judge Eleanor Thompson's chambers. The day had been long, and the trial's aftermath clung to her like a second skin. The faint hum of traffic outside reminded her that life moved on. But inside these walls, time felt frozen. Eleanor sat at her desk, a single case file in front of her, the file labeled State of Louisiana versus Benjamin Carter. It felt heavier than any she had ever held. Her fingertips traced the edge of the folder, and for a moment, she closed her eyes. Benjamin's face lingered in her mind, along with the weight of his words. "You were afraid. But I was in chains." Maggie. Her childhood nickname still echoed in her ears. A soft knock at the door broke her reverie. It was Amanda Price, clutching her leather case and looking far less guarded than she had in the courtroom. "Judge Ellison?" Amanda said softly. Eleanor gestured for her to enter. Amanda hesitated before speaking. "I just wanted to thank you for what you did back there. I know it wasn't easy." Eleanor shook her head. "I didn't do enough, Amanda. And that's something I'll have to live with." Amanda nodded, her sharp confidence replaced by something gentler. "But you did something. And sometimes, That's where change begins. The young attorney turned to leave. But before she stepped out, Eleanor called after her. "Amanda?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Don't stop fighting the way you did for Benjamin. People like you, people like him, they deserve better." Amanda gave a small, appreciative smile before slipping out the door. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, staring at the scales of justice mounted on the wall. They were meant to symbolize fairness, balance, and truth. But today, they felt more like a reminder of how fragile those ideals could be. The system she had served for decades wasn't broken, it was cracked. Cracked in ways that let assumptions and biases seep in, tilting the scales just enough to endanger lives like Benjamin's. The next morning, Eleanor stood in front of a group of young law clerks and junior attorneys gathered in her courtroom. Sunlight poured in through the tall windows, illuminating the polished wood and solemn faces before her. She spoke clearly, her voice firm but filled with emotion. Justice isn't just about following laws, it's about understanding the weight of the decisions we make while wearing this robe. It's about questioning our assumptions, challenging our biases, and refusing to let fear guide our actions. Benjamin Carter deserved better from all of us, and I'll carry the burden of knowing I could have done more. The room was silent as her words hung in the air. Eleanor continued, her voice steady. "But this isn't just about one man or one case. It's about all the people who stand in courtrooms like this one, hoping, praying that someone will truly see them. From this day forward, I will not let fear silence me again." The faces in the room were a mix of awe and reflection. Some nodded subtly, others avoided her gaze. But all were listening. When the lecture was over and the clerks filed out, Eleanor remained standing at the bench. She placed her hand on the gavel, feeling its familiar weight. Change would not come overnight. The cracks in the system were deep and stubborn. But Eleanor Thompson had made a vow to herself, to Benjamin, and to every person who would ever stand in her courtroom. Justice wasn't just about the letter of the law. It was about the courage to honor its spirit. As Eleanor looked out over the empty courtroom, she felt something she hadn't in days: resolve. And somewhere beyond those courthouse walls, Benjamin Carter walked free, carrying his own burden, but also a sliver of hope that maybe, just maybe, the world could change.
Sometimes justice isn't black and white, it's found in the choices we make when no one's watching. Do you believe Judge Ellison followed her heart or her duty? Share your thoughts and this story with others. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.